The fall of Assad, what happens next for Syria and the region? Just over a week ago, Syria witnessed a historic shift, the fall of President Bashar al-Assad's 54-year-long regime. But what does this mean for Syria and the broader Middle East? The celebrations across Syria have been electrifying, but what lies ahead for a country so torn apart by conflict? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Why did Assad's regime collapse so suddenly? The uprising against Assad began in 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring. Protesters demanding freedom were met with brutal repression, sparking violence and the formation of rebel groups. What pushed Assad's regime to the brink of collapse, despite years of resistance from Russia and Iran? How did HTS seize Damascus? The shocking turn of events in late November, when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a group with past links to al-Qaeda, took control of Aleppo and moved swiftly towards Damascus, took many by surprise. What led to their unexpected success? Could they have gained power without the backing of Turkey or their well-organized structure? The role of global powers. Why did Russia abandon Assad? For years, Russia was Assad's staunch ally, but their sudden withdrawal and the absence of critical support from Iran and Hezbollah seemed to seal his fate. Why did these powers abandon Assad, and how does this shift impact their influence in the region? What does the future hold for Syria? With HTS in control of Syria's capital, will the group's reputation as a terrorist organization prevent them from gaining international support? Will the possibility of lifting their terrorist designation affect their governance, and can Syria rebuild after years of war? The Kurdish question: what's next for the Syrian democratic forces? As Syrian Kurdish forces navigate between competing factions, how will they fare under a new regime led by HTS? With Turkey's influence growing, what could this mean for Syria's Kurdish population? Regional consequences: could Iran and Russia expand their influence? With the Syrian government overthrown, will Iran accelerate its nuclear and chemical weapon programs as a new strategy for deterrence? And could Russia's withdrawal from Syria prompt them to assert power in other countries? Narrator: the fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad just over a week. Man yelling in foreign language, it's the end of a 54-year-long regime in Syria, but it's just the beginning of a reshifting of power, not just in Syria, but in the whole region. Right now, most Syrians are in a state of euphoria that there is an end to this brutal repression, corruption, exploitation, but what lies ahead is certainly very uncertain for many Syrians. Narrator: here's how Syria got to this point and what might happen next with a group the US designates as a terrorist organization now in charge. Group chanting: the civil war against Assad began during the Arab Spring in 2011, where countries throughout the Middle East saw uprisings and revolutions against authoritarian regimes. Syria was no exception. The Assad regime's immediate response was brute force, even torturing children that had written graffiti on a wall. And this kind of deep humiliation really angered the entire population. And you saw protests just spontaneously rise up throughout the country. And the regime unfortunately doubled down on that brute force. And so, eventually, you saw many of those protesters form their own armed groups to defend their communities. Narrator: rebels even captured the largest city at the time, Aleppo. It took 4 years, but Assad eventually recaptured it using chemical weapons against his own people, and largely because of the backing and direct military support of Iran and Russia. Syria has actually historic ties to Russia, but I think what Putin saw during the war is an opening to become a great power. The Iranians, on the other hand, have long had an alliance with the Assad regime. It's an essential element of the so-called Shia Crescent in which Tehran wants access through Iraq, Syria, and into Lebanon and the Mediterranean through its proxy militias in Iraq, and of course, in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Assad was a key to that route. Narrator: over the last 13 years, dozens of groups fought against the Assad regime and each other, but today, there are 3 main ones who hold territory within Syria. There's the Syrian National Army or SNA, which is basically a hodgepodge of different rebel groups that had fought the regime all over Syria, but had been displaced to northern Syria in recent years. And they have become this somewhat undisciplined army that is backed by Turkey and unfortunately often has to do Ankar's bidding for that reason rather than face off with the regime. Narrator: then there's the Syrian Democratic Forces, another hodgepodge of rebel groups of primarily Kurdish fighters, an ethnic minority. They're backed by the US and often clash with the Turkish-backed SNA. And quite critically, they guard the prisons in the northeast that have ISIS fighters in them. So they're a really critical component to stability as well. Narrator: and then there's the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. This is who ultimately led the offensive to capture Damascus. They were originally established as an al-Qaeda affiliate, led by a man who later led ISIS. They broke ties with al-Qaeda in 2016, but are still considered a terrorist organization by the US, Turkey and others. It was in firm control of Idlib city and much of the province beforehand and had ruled that area with an iron fist. But it is one of the more disciplined and independent armed groups in Syria. Narrator, in late November, HTS advanced from Idlib to Aleppo, which they seized in just a few days, with not just military and violence, but governance. They immediately went into Aleppo and they tried to prevent looting, protect government institutions. They told former soldiers and government employees to stay in their posts as long as they renounced any kind of, allegiance to Assad. They went around and tried to reassure minorities that they would not be harmed. Siren wailing, narrator, Assad and Russian forces launched airstrikes in Aleppo and Idlib. At least 12 civilians were killed, but it didn't slow HTS, who quickly took Homs, and eventually moved on to the capital, Damascus. Assad fled to Russia and Syrians celebrated across the country and across the world. Men yelling in foreign language. I think what was most shocking is the abandonment of Assad by his stalwart allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah in particular. Narrator, experts believe these allies were too entangled in their own conflicts with Israel and Ukraine to have been much help to Assad. To see that the Russians abandon Assad in the way that they did in recent days was actually quite shocking. They certainly at least want to maintain their naval base and their air base in Syria, and yet when the rebels fell Aleppo, messages out of the Kremlin seem to be, Assad, deal with it. We're busy. Turkey seems to be the winner in all of this. They have potentially green-lighted this offensive in the first place. They will be able to essentially carry out whatever they want in Syria in the next couple of months as we wait for the new US president to come in. And that is a really terrifying future for the Kurdish population in Syria. This is a historic day for the Middle East, the collapse of the Assad regime. The tyranny in Damascus offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. Narrator, besides the conflicts between Turkish and Kurdish forces, we could see Russia assert power in other countries, or Iran, too. Many people are wondering if they will simply accelerate the nuclear program, which it seems like they're doing as a different sort of deterrent strategy or even a chemical weapons program for that matter. Narrator, and within Syria, the occupying forces are still labeled as a terrorist organization, which could make cooperation and humanitarian aid difficult. We know that they have some bad behavior in Idlib, but that they're also a very pragmatic group and desperately want to get off of the terrorism designation list. So there is a vulnerability that was there to exploit. If people are not allowed to invest, if aid is not allowed to get into the country, it's going to be a real disaster. Likewise, if the designations are lifted without getting any kind of promises or reassurances of what HTS behavior will look like in the future and other groups as well, it could equally be a disaster for Syria's future. Light music. The fall of Assad's regime is just the beginning of a dangerous new chapter in Syria. While Syrians celebrate the end of a brutal dictatorship, questions loom over the country's future and its place in an unstable region. What challenges will Syria face as the new power dynamics take shape? Will HTS succeed in governing, or will they fall victim to their own violent history? What do you think lies ahead for Syria?